Okay. So first of all, if I can get this to, there we go. So standing on this stage has been a bucket list item of mine for a really long time. I've been coming to Creative Mornings talks for probably the last decade in multiple locations. So I want to thank Jessamy and the team for welcoming me into the family. So this is me, kind of in a nutshell in 2 photos, I think. You can call me Dr. Maz or Mazzy P. I'm a copywriter, creativity coach, gym junkie, goofball, recovering people pleaser, and the cherry on top, childhood trauma survivor. Yep. And so when I was little, life was an utter shit show. I would lock myself away. I would draw, sing, compose, paint, write, do just about anything to escape the reality of my life. As an only child of divorced parents, including an alcoholic mum, we were living on Salvo's hampers on the Gold Coast, so it was really, really easy to get angry about my lot in life. But I didn't. I channeled all of that frustration, that rage, that anger into making things, which is why I believe I'm actually standing in front of you today. So Kismet, aka fate or destiny, I don't think it's predetermined. I think as creatives that we really are the gatekeepers of our own destiny. We have the skills, the intelligence, and power to take any challenge, any experience we go through and turn it into something productive and into gold. But we often take our creativity for granted, putting it in service of our clients, our friends, and even the market, forgetting that it's one of the most powerful forms of self-care there actually is. And I believe you can save yourself over and over again with creativity. You can spiral up, not down, and by harnessing creativity as more than just making art, if you're willing, as the quote says. And today I want to show you how, by sharing an encounter that I had with Kismet between the years of 2013 and 2017. So the result was a PhD project called The Missed Encounter, where I produced an artist book titled Mother, or M/Other. It was filled with poetry, prose, and photography. And so my research explores the relationship between creativity and post-traumatic growth, or PTG as it's known, particularly how we can use creativity to bolster ourselves against life's inevitable ups and downs. And so creativity really did shepherd me through this journey and one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. Destiny gave me a really good opportunity to practice what I preach as I answered this question. In the face of trauma, why do some people not only bounce back, but go on to flourish? But to start, I think it's helpful that we define a few things. And I want to start with creativity itself. So for me, it's an organic, internal experience of connecting the dots in new and interesting ways. It's also a product, a process, and a practice, which is what I call the 3 Ps of creativity. So it's kind of like an iceberg, if you can picture it. We've got the water at the top, and then the top of the iceberg, sticking out of the water, is the product. It's the thing that people see. It is the result of whatever process you've undertaken. Could be your business, a painting, etc. Just below the surface, the giant hunk of ice is the process. So this is the how. This is everything you've done to create the thing that people see that sticks out above the water. But then, at the very, very bottom of the iceberg, at the depths, the freezing cold water, is the practice. So that's what you do day in and day out to create the life that you want. So it's not just about what you make. Next, I want to define post-traumatic growth for you, particularly if you haven't heard this concept before. So it comes out of positive psychology, and it's a term coined by researchers Tedeschi and Calhoun in the late 90s. And essentially it means a positive psychological change is experienced as a result of struggling with highly challenging, highly stressful life circumstances. I like to think of it as the more positive counterpart to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in the literature, it's often described as a spiral. And so why a spiral? Well, a spiral is a naturally occurring phenomenon where something winds in a continuous and gradually widening or tightening curve, either around a central point on an axis or a flat surface, to form this kind of cone shape. It's a significant shape, I think, because the end of the curve never returns to where it started from. It's continually evolving and changing, which I think is actually a really nice metaphor for growth itself. And then the last definition I want to give you is about trauma. And there are a lot of different ones floating around, but I subscribe to Gabor Mate's definition of trauma as not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you, which is what I love so much about this concept of post-traumatic growth, is that it focuses on and pulls focus on the struggle we have as a result of what happened to us as we integrate that experience into the person we're going to become. So, okay, just dumped a whole lot of information on you. This is where we get to the heart of what I'm interested in, which is this idea of how can we spiral up with creativity? So is there a way to bolster ourselves against life's challenges? And I believe we can. So I want to share with you part of the research, which are these 5 domains of life or post-traumatic growth, but with a twist. So this is where growth after trauma typically shows up in someone who is experiencing post-traumatic growth. And the way that they figure it out, and by they, I mean psychologists and mental health professionals, of which I am neither, but I'm interested in it, is that people can fill out the post-traumatic growth inventory questionnaire. So it's kind of a bit of a self-ascribed experience. But rather than solely looking at these 5 domains of life in isolation, I've reversed engineered them and turned them into practical goals or intentions that you can use to build a rock-solid creative mindset. And so these 5 domains became the anchor for my research and the life raft I clung to during my PhD when the absolute unthinkable happened, which I'll explain soon. So let's start with the first domain, which is relationships with others, which in the research is described as social support, connection, and a sense of belonging. So when I think back to my PhD, to the beginning of it, I was kind of headhunted, which sounds really weird to say. But I was wrapping up my master's project, which again was another really intense experience, when my high school art teacher sent me a Facebook message maybe, and asked me what I was going to do next. Her name is Professor Lexi Lassick, so shout out, amazing lady. She suggested that I come and do a PhD project with her, and naturally I was like, do you see how much study I've just done? I was like, no. But I was still curious. So, and she, like, having known me for like 20 plus years, she was like, you can do anything you want. So I then responded by saying, what if I did a creative project about what I went through in my childhood with my mum, using my teenage diaries as part of the research methodology? She was really excited by that, which is really funny to watch academics get excited because they totally nerd out. But it took me about 3 months to put together my application. But when I was accepted, there was some kind of just this cosmic alignment that just felt really right. And it's an experience that I've only had maybe one other time since. But 3 days after I started my project, I got a call from Robina Hospital on the Gold Coast. My mum had admitted herself overnight, and they told me that there was a 50-50 chance that she was actually going to make it through the surgery that they were about to do. So unbeknownst to us or to her, an ulcer had burnt through one of her intestinal tracts. She hadn't actually been absorbing any nutrients for probably about a year and a half. So naturally, the very next morning, I got on a plane to go and see her. Despite all the odds, and this is like something I share with my mum, she managed to shock even the doctors and pull through the surgery. So as I began my intense PhD journey, she was in rehab, unable to drink alcohol for the very first time in her life, probably, And I witnessed this bizarre kind of clarity start to form, and her entire demeanour started to change, which was incredibly awe-inspiring. And so, to nurture your relationships with others from a post-traumatic growth lens, you can start by journaling on or asking yourself these questions. Where do I feel connected, seen, and supported? Who will understand what I'm going through? So even though my relationship with my mum was incredibly complicated, in my entire life I've always been so lucky to have the support of friends, their parents, and particularly teachers and mentors who were always very, very patient with me and understanding, particularly during this project. Okay, domain number 2, personal strength, which the research defines as positive personality traits, knowledge, and abilities. So needless to say, the first year of my PhD was utter chaos. Not only was I dealing with what was happening with my mum, but I constantly questioned my choice to go down this path, especially as most of my friends had jobs and were doing all kinds of cool things and I was stuck at home. But I felt like a complete imposter in academia, especially because my research methodology was very creative and I was in an education faculty. So you can imagine just the kinds of conversations that I was coming up against. But my intuition, however, was just humming along and whispering quietly, telling me to keep going, keep pushing. So I leant in and I immersed myself in the research and I started to dig and follow connections, and I gathered a ton of intel. And I also used my teenage diaries as the primary data through which to unpack experiences and search for evidence of, at that point, I was looking for resilience. But I knew I'm going to have to really develop some serious hardcore strength to make it through the next 4.5 years, mentally, physically, and emotionally. So that's what I did. I immersed myself in yoga. I also got my 200-hour YTT certification. And while you don't need to become a yogi to develop personal strength, you 100% need to double down on all the positive traits that you have in order to make the things that maybe are less desirable about yourself become less prominent. And so to build personal strength, you need to know how to cope or how you cope. So when life gets tricky, what do you turn to? Are those habits healthy? This is a good opportunity to be honest with yourself. And if you don't like the answers that come back, at least you know and you can do something about it. So these are the kind of questions that I was asking myself at the beginning of my research. So how do I and how did I cope with life's challenges, and what activities gave me strength? And then I started practicing them. Domain area number 3, appreciation of life. So this is defined as recognition and enjoyment of the good. So while I was studying, I spent a shitload of time alone, which probably explains why the pandemic, it was kind of stressful, but also felt very familiar. So I spent hours and hours reading, taking notes, and getting cross-eyed from all the information. And I think roughly in my thesis, I probably referenced around 400 to 450 journal articles, maybe around 70 books. So you can imagine the amount of time I spent squirreled away. At times, I found myself getting resentful, exhausted, doing the whole on your knees screaming at the sky, why? Not really enjoying myself or the journey at all. So you can imagine how pissed I was when I discovered these five life areas and saw that appreciation of life was one of them. But something kind of clicked for me. I believe growth isn't about the big leaps and bounds we take, but it's about the small moments. Appreciation is about savouring life's simple pleasures. So from your first all-pressed coffee in the morning to the feeling of fresh and clean sheets when you jump into bed at night. But I decided at the same time, because doing a PhD thesis and a creative work wasn't enough, I thought I would also document my experience. So I started to draw. And when I first started out, it was seriously stick figures and everything was all over the place. But it didn't take me long to develop a style And it was nothing fancy, it was just a few details from my day, which at that point was quite boring. And it was just done in black ink and really cheap Crayola colouring pencils. But what it did was it forced me to engage with life beyond my research and gave me a break from Google Scholar. So if you ever find yourself on autopilot in life and you really want to snap yourself out of it, I want you to start by reflecting on the things that you take for granted. And so, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, as creatives, we often take our own creativity for granted. So perhaps that's a good place to start. When was the last time you created just for the sake of creating, or even just to feel good? Then you might like to build out a list of things to savor. And this is something that I often ask my creativity coaching clients to do. Sunsets, hugs from friends, puppies and kittens, anything that you enjoy and really pulls you out of your head and brings you back to your life. Domain number 4, spiritual or existential change. And this is defined as fracturing or obliteration of meaning. So at the end of my first year of my PhD, I had my confirmation of candidature, or what we lovingly refer to as the cock. This is where you present your first few chapters of your research and stand before an illustrious panel of academics to basically get the go-ahead to keep going. So the feedback from mine was that I had too many ideas and options, which honestly standard, and that I had to choose just one to go ahead with. The panel told me in no uncertain terms, go away for a couple of weeks, reflect on the research that you have, and then refine it down and let us know which direction that you choose. So 3 days later, on November 15, 2014, I got the call that nobody wants and that nobody's ever really prepared for. The night before, my mum had passed away in her sleep. So she had emphysema on top of health issues from alcoholism, even though she's a total babe. So her lungs, they just kind of gave out. And while I'm grateful that she didn't suffer, I didn't get to say goodbye. And I also didn't get to ask her all the questions that I wanted to ask her about what we've been through. But a few days later, once the shock had worn off, I called Lexi, my PhD supervisor, and I gave her the news. And rather than mollycoddle me, she asked me one of the most powerful questions I've ever been asked. What are you going to make of this? And so I knew right there and then that the direction of my research needed to be about my mum and I and our story. I needed to tell that story, which is one of post-traumatic growth, to show how creativity can be a force for good even in our darkest days. I was very, very acutely aware of the significance of that moment and how significant it would be for my future. And I chose to lean the fuck in. I hadn't been taken out yet, and I certainly wasn't going to let this one take me out. And so I just wanted to drop these questions up here because when something really, really terrible happens, there's going to be a period of time where you can't do anything. But at some point, there's going to be a moment where you wake up in the morning and you're ready and you're like, what do I do next? You've got all the shattered pieces of everything that's happened. And these two questions are incredibly powerful. Who can I become? And then more importantly, what do I need this to mean? Domain number 5, new possibilities, my favorite. So this is defined as a shift in perspective and identifying opportunities. So once I made the decision to tell this story, everything fell into place. Some might say it was Kismet, wink. That's when I found the concept of post-traumatic growth, and I realized I was living my research as I was creating it. So it was life imitating art, imitating life. I felt my identity was starting to shift, and the purpose behind my project and my work was deepening. So this project wasn't just for me now, It was for every single motherless daughter out there and woman who was healing herself from a traumatic childhood. And as I named that meaning, I myself started to heal. Oh, one more thing. I also managed to blag my way into an artist residency in Argentina, paid for by my university. Props to Southern Cross University, thank you. So this is me on the left in front of a fancy fountain. And in the middle here is the cafe where I wrote all of the creative work that I literally showed up to day after day for an entire month and just cried and wrote. But I did eventually graduate, so that's good. There's me on the right with a funny hat on. So my point is that as a creative person, you can take absolutely anything and make it your own. Even a stuffy PhD, which is traditionally very dry, can become a soul-stretching, mind-altering, heart-stopping bender of epic proportions. But you have to be the one to take the wheel. So to end, I want to read one of the final poems from Mother, which is the PhD book I created. Just one sec. It's going to be a bit awkward. Oh yeah, this is great. All right. Thank you so much. This is a poem called W. You were generous with your words. For you, love was taken freely, given like the flu, a sneeze into your elbow crease. Maybe that's why I don't trust love, why it took me 29 years to feel it for you, to feel it from you. The fact remains, I loved you and you left over and over again. We never had enough time or the words to express the convoluted version of love we embodied. We can love and be left behind. It's possible. We can be loved and be left alone, an active feeling precipitated by loss. But we don't snap shut inside. We're cracked open for love, to flood in, filling the darkened gaps with what we couldn't let in willingly. In hindsight, loss is love. It means we cared so fiercely that love left its mark, like tide lines receded, like barnacles on a pier, like stains on a sink. Some of it we can see just below the surface, but what we don't know, what we can't know, stains our insides. Thank you.